Now, in the past decade, we have seen the spread of race-based politics cause division and damage in Western nations. The liberal left is fervently pushing the narrative that countries such as the US, Britain and Australia are fundamentally racist. And there is little pushback on that narrative. Rakib Ehsan is the author of the new book, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities, which is set to be hitting the bookshelves this week. And he joins me now. Rakib, congratulations on your work here. Tell me, what are the dangers of liberal left ideologues when it comes to maintaining social cohesion?
Well, I think there's some very clear dangers here, Rita, which I cover in my book. In the UK in recent times, we've seen liberal left activists essentially offered the view that the UK's economic, social and political systems are deliberately rigged against the country's ethnic minorities. And I think that it's very important to push back against this dangerous narrative. I make very clearly this point in the book, that when you look at, for example, the provision of anti-discrimination protections, the UK is one of the leading countries in the world. It's also the case when it comes to the provision of religious freedoms. And I think that the point that I make in Beyond Grievance is there's a wealth of survey data which now shows that ethnic minorities are broadly satisfied with British democracy and appreciative of the protections, opportunities and freedoms offered to them under their democracy.
And they do particularly well. That's something that gets lost in all the grievance pushing, that ethnic minorities often are some of the top earners in any country. You look at the US, you look at the UK, here in Australia, you have minorities who come here often with very little, and within a generation, they have built wealth. They've given their children a really good start and good education, and the next generation achieves even more. So that seems to be lost in this narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that story of intergenerational progress has very much taken place in the UK. When it comes to educational outcomes, for example, in the UK, particularly in England, pupils of Chinese, Indian, Bangladeshi and Black African origin, and indeed pupils of Pakistani origin, they're now performing better than the white British mainstream when it comes to attainment 8. This is essentially a GCSE level qualifications, 8 in total, and you calculate the average. And you also talk about earnings. Workers of Indian and Chinese origin now have a high level of median hourly pay in the UK when compared to their white British counterparts. So I just think that you wouldn't have those kind of positive outcomes for particular ethnic minorities if we were living in a fundamentally racist society.
So what's your reaction to the push we're seeing from the left for things like reparations and constitutional recognition and even the affirmative action that we see in universities and some workplaces?
Well, I think that the context in the US is quite different to the one in the UK. I always make the point that these are two countries with very different histories and national contexts surrounding race. The general view among ethnic minorities in the UK is they expect fairness, not favours. And I've always been of the view that the phrase positive discrimination is a real oxymoron. I think the emphasis should be on equality of opportunity. And I think I'd make this point. I don't see the UK through rose-tinted spectacles, in my view. I think there are improvements to be made. I think, for example, in healthcare, when it comes to an ever-diversifying population, it is important that you have a truly responsive healthcare system. I think that there are improvements to be made in terms of rebuilding police-community relations, especially in London. I also think that when it comes to the labour market, names which are not traditionally English sounding as such, they traditionally fare worse in employment processes compared to names which are traditionally English sounding, even when you control for things such as education level, skills, etc. So I think there are improvements to be made, but I think a mature anti-racist politics would also recognise the significant progress that the UK has made when it comes to racial equality.
Now, Rakib, you say that there needs to be a greater appreciation of faith and acknowledgement of how faith is a source of resilience and strength for minority communities. Explain that to my audience. What do you mean by that? And what, again, do I think politicians from the left and the right miss about these migrant communities being overwhelmingly socially conservative?
No, absolutely. And another point that I make in the book is that I believe that a stable family unit is the finest form of social security known to humankind. And I think faith nestles into that. My argument that I make in the book is that I do think there's a secular liberal tendency on the liberal left, which almost sneers at faith and religion, which I don't think is entirely helpful. I think that traditional ethnic and religious minorities living in the UK, as I say in the book, their faith is a source of optimism. It's their source of resilience as well. And I think they draw a degree of determination from their religious beliefs. And of course, I challenge extremist views in the book, and I think that the country's mainstream should be unapologetic when it comes to confronting forms of religious extremism. But I think that a healthy relationship with faith within ethnic minorities actually provides those foundations to provide that sense of belonging and rootedness. So I also talk about religious and cultural associations, which are able to combat social isolation and loneliness. And I think that the liberal left could do with recognizing that if they want to re-engage with traditional ethnic minorities in the UK.
Now, before I let you go, you've got to tell my audience about what's happening with Nicola Sturgeon. The former Scottish First Minister has been arrested over an investigation into SNP party finances. What's this about?
Well, Rita, I don't want to smile too much, but for me, I found it to be fairly positive news from a unionist perspective. I want our union to remain intact. But I have to say that this ongoing investigation into the Scottish National Party's funding and financial affairs, it's a disgrace to British democracy. Now, we have to make the point that Nicola Sturgeon was released without charge, but the fact that she was arrested and we had this ongoing investigation, which her husband has been entangled in, I think that it really doesn't do much for British democracy at all. And I think that you'll see in the next general election, which is scheduled to be next year, possibly in autumn, I think the SNP will lose a good number of seats in Scotland, possibly to the Labour Party.
Interesting times indeed. Rakib Ehsan, thank you so much for your time, and your book, Beyond Grievance, will be available from next week. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Rita.